A clock stopped at midnight, and so did a heartbeat. Welcome to Midnight Confessions. I am your host, Danny. I love seeing this mystery-loving community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. Your comments always make this journey even more thrilling. Let's begin. It was 4:30 in the tranquil village of St. Mary Mead, and the vicarage drawing room was bathed in the mellow glow of late afternoon. The lace curtains fluttered gently with the May breeze, carrying in the mingled scent of lilacs and freshly mown grass. Mrs. Bantry, comfortably seated near the hearth despite the season, was deep in conversation with the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement. Miss Jane Marple sat nearby, her delicate hands folded neatly in her lap, a cup of Darjeeling balanced with the precision of long habit. She had said very little, as usual, but her eyes, those deceptively mild blue eyes, missed nothing. The talk had turned, as it often did, to the recent arrival of the mysterious Mr. Leonard Quill, who had taken residence at Ivy Cottage. Such a quiet man, Mrs. Bantry was saying, stirring her tea with unnecessary vigor. Hardly speaks to anyone. They say he's retired from the Foreign Office, or perhaps dismissed from it. There's always something odd about men who live alone. Mrs. Clement gave a soft, indulgent laugh. Oh, Dolly, you mustn't be suspicious of everyone who enjoys solitude. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I've often found, she said mildly, that people who live alone do so either because they have nothing to hide, or quite the opposite. There was a comfortable chuckle all round, and then, as if on cue, the church clock across the green began to chime 5. Yet oddly, as the last bell echoed, another sound followed. A frantic knocking at the vicarage door. Within moments, young Tommy Pierce, the errand boy, burst in, his freckled face pale and eyes wide. It's Mr. Quill, ma'am, down by the clock tower. He's dead. The teacups rattled, and for a moment no one spoke. Mrs. Bantry gasped and clutched her pearls. The vicar's wife stood abruptly, her face stricken. Only Miss Marple remained perfectly still. Her cup was returned to its saucer with a tiny, decisive click. Dear me, she murmured softly, and just after the clock struck 5. How very curious. By 6 o'clock, all of St. Mary Mead was alive with gossip. From the post office to the grocer's, whispers of murder fluttered like startled sparrows. Constable Briggs had cordoned off the little green where the old clock tower stood. There, beneath the ivy and shadows, lay Leonard Quill, his head resting at an unnatural angle, his walking stick beside him. But it was the clock above, the venerable clock that had marked generations of weddings, funerals, and harvest feasts, that drew Miss Marple's quiet attention. Its long hand pointed stubbornly to 5 o'clock. The clock had stopped, Miss Marple's thought. Unspoken? A clock that stops at the very moment of death, either an eerie coincidence or someone's deliberate attempt to make time lie. The body of Mr. Leonard Quill lay upon the grass, beneath the shadow of the clock tower, a single shaft of sunlight catching on the silver of his pocket watch chain. A small gathering had already formed. The usual mixture of curiosity, fear, and the irresistible hunger for gossip that seemed to define St. Mary Mead in moments of drama. Constable Briggs, red-faced and perspiring in his ill-fitting uniform, was attempting to hold the crowd at bay. Now then, you lot, move along, there's nothing to see here, he barked, though the statement was patently untrue. Miss Marple, standing a little apart, observed with calm detachment. She had known Constable Briggs since he was a boy, having caught him stealing apples from the vicar's orchard many years ago. His manner had not changed much, officious and easily flustered. The vicar, Reverend Clement, knelt beside the body, murmuring a brief prayer. He rose and looked helplessly toward the constable. You must send for the inspector, Briggs. Mr. Quill deserves proper investigation. Aye, sir, Briggs replied, fumbling with his notebook. Inspector Craddock will want to see this himself. Nasty business. Nasty indeed. He scratched his chin. Doesn't look like a robbery. Poor man's watch is still in his pocket, though the face of it's cracked, I see. Miss Marple's eyes followed his gesture. The pocket watch lay half buried in the grass, its glass shattered, hands frozen at precisely 5 o'clock, matching the clock tower above. Coincidence, perhaps, but Miss Marple had never been much inclined to believe in coincidences. "Strange, isn't it?" she said softly, "how time seems to have stopped for poor Mr. Quill. Twice over." Mrs. Bantry, who had hurried over despite her husband's protests, gave a little shudder. "Oh, Jane, you do say the most morbid things. Do you really think it was murder? He might have just fallen, you know." Miss Marple nodded politely. "Indeed he might. And yet," she said, her gaze drifting toward the base of the tower, "I fancy there are few people who fall with such tidy precision, their walking stick neatly beside them." Briggs frowned. "You mean someone arranged him?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple said lightly. "I mean only that people who fall unexpectedly tend to do so messily. It's the nature of surprise." Before Briggs could make sense of that remark, a motor car approached from the direction of Much Benham, and a tall man in a trench coat stepped out. Inspector Craddock, a familiar figure in the region, adjusted his hat against the sun and strode toward the little crowd. "What have we this time, Briggs?" he asked briskly. "Dead man, sir. Name of Quill. Lives at Ivy Cottage. Looks like a fall or a blow. Can't rightly. Say, found by young Tommy Pierce at about 5 o'clock. Craddock crouched, inspecting the body. His eyes, keen and practiced, noted the peculiar angle of the man's neck and the faint indentation behind the ear. "Blow with something blunt?" he muttered. "Possibly struck from behind. There's some dirt under the fingernails. Suggests a struggle." He stood, brushing off his hands. "And what's this about the clock stopping?" "The tower clock, sir. Stopped at 5 exactly. Same as his watch," Briggs said almost eagerly. Craddock glanced at Miss Marple then, and the faintest smile tugged at his mouth. "Ah, Miss Marple, I should have known you'd appear before I'd even finished my tea." "I happened to be nearby," she replied demurely, "and one doesn't often have a murder occur between scones and the second cup." The inspector gave a dry chuckle. "I don't suppose you've seen anything unusual today." Miss Marple's expression remained mild. "Only the usual signs of human nature, Inspector, which, as you know, are seldom as ordinary as they seem." "Quite." He turned to Briggs. "Have the body taken to the doctor. I want the report tonight, and get the names of everyone who saw him last." As the constable busied himself with his notes, Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the distant outline of Ivy Cottage, a small, ivy-draped home on the edge of the green, now shuttered and silent. "Mr. Quill was not much liked, was he?" she said conversationally to Mrs. Bantry. "Oh, no one knew much about him at all," Mrs. Bantry replied eagerly. "Kept to himself, hardly ever came to church, though there were those letters." "Letters?" "Yes. Mrs. Price from the post office said he received foreign post nearly every week, all from some place in Switzerland. Very suspicious, don't you think? And the maid at the vicarage swears she saw him arguing with Major Pritchard last Thursday outside the grocer's." "Major Pritchard?" Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. "That's rather interesting. The Major never argues. He lectures. There's a difference, you know." The conversation was interrupted by a loud cry from Tommy Pierce, who had been poking about the grass with a stick. "Sir, sir, there's something here." He held up a torn scrap of fabric, dark blue with a thin stripe of red. Inspector Craddock took it, frowning. "Coat cloth, likely, but not from Quill's jacket. This is thicker. Military cut, maybe." Miss Marple's lips curved just faintly. "Major Pritchard does favor that shade, I believe, though I shouldn't like to jump to conclusions. Still, one wonders what brings two men to words, and one of them to death, over something as unremarkable as a Thursday morning." Craddock pocketed the scrap and signaled his men to move the body. The villagers began to drift away, whispering as they went, each convinced they already knew. the truth. By the time the crowd had thinned, Miss Marple remained the only figure still watching the tower. The stopped clock loomed above her like an unblinking eye. She noted the faint smear of grease along its base. An odd thing, for the tower had not been serviced in months. And then, as if reminded of some long-ago memory, Miss Marple's expression softened into that knowing look she wore when the first faint outline of a pattern began to take shape. The next morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to scandal. The newspaper boy shouted the headlines before breakfast, "Mysterious Death at St. Mary Mead Clock Tower." And by noon, 3 separate versions of the story had been invented. In one, Mr. Quill had been struck by lightning. In another, poisoned by a jealous lover. In a third, he had taken his own life out of remorse for a crime long past. Miss Marple listened to each account with the air of polite interest. Over her morning tea, she remarked to her maid, "People are like clockwork, you know, Mary. Their habits keep time most faithfully, until something interferes with the mechanism." Mary blinked. "You mean like the clock stopping, ma'am?" "Exactly," Miss Marple said softly, glancing toward the church tower visible from her window. "Something, or someone, stopped it, and I should very much like to know who wound it last." The morning after the tragedy dawned with a quiet mist that clung to the hedgerows and veiled the thatched roofs of St. Mary Mead in a damp melancholy. The village had not known such restless talk in years, and by 9 o'clock the post office was crowded with purposeful idlers pretending to buy stamps, only to linger and exchange theories about the late Mr. Quill. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, had become the de facto curator of village intelligence, and she managed her role with an air of solemn self-importance. "Oh, there's no doubt it was murder," she declared to Miss Hartnell, who leaned conspiratorially across the counter. "Inspector Craddock himself said there were signs of a blow. Besides, the poor man's letters, always from that Swiss address. Well, that's hardly innocent, is it? Spies, if you ask me." Miss Hartnell nodded with relish. "Foreigners," she said, lowering her voice as if the Alps might overhear. "They're behind everything these days." Miss Marple, entering quietly with her knitting bag in hand, offered a gentle smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Price. I just came to post a note to my nephew. How very busy you are this morning." The postmistress brightened. "Ah, Miss Marple, I expect you've heard about the dreadful affair. Such wickedness in our own village. Between ourselves, it's my belief Mr. Quill wasn't who he said he was." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured, carefully affixing her stamp. "And who do you suppose he was, then?" Mrs. Price lowered her voice further. "Some say he had a wife abroad, others that he'd been mixed up in political things. But the Major, oh, he's in a state this morning, I can tell you. Came in early asking whether any telegrams for him had arrived. Looked pale as milk." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, though her fingers paused briefly on the envelope. "Poor Major Pritchard," she said softly. "Such a sensitive man. I do hope his nerves aren't troubling him again." As she left the post office, the murmur of voices swelled behind her. The gossip had taken root, and in St. Mary Mead that was as inevitable as the ivy that crept over every stone wall. She walked slowly toward Ivy Cottage, which lay at the far end of the green, half hidden behind its overgrown garden. The gate creaked as she entered. A police constable stood outside the door, looking uncomfortable and damp. He straightened quickly at her approach. "I'm afraid you can't go in, miss," he said, not unkindly. "Inspector's orders." "Oh, of course not," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "I only wanted to see whether the cat had been fed. Mr. Quill's tabby used to wander into my garden occasionally." The constable hesitated, unsure whether feeding cats counted as interfering with police work. "Well, I suppose that's all right, ma'am. Poor creature's been howling since yesterday." Miss Marple nodded gratefully and moved toward the small kitchen window. Through the pane, she could just make out the interior, neat, tidy, yet curiously impersonal. On the table lay an open ledger, and beside it a small vase of faded violets. Everything bore the air of a man who lived by routine. Everything except the clock upon the mantel, whose hands, she noticed, stood also at 5. Later that morning, Inspector Craddock came to call upon Miss Marple at her cottage. He had the air of a man who respected her mind but distrusted her methods, and yet somehow always found himself back at her door. "I've been making inquiries," he said after she had poured him tea. "It seems our Mr. Quill had been receiving money from abroad, regular payments from an account in Geneva, and Major Pritchard admits to having quarrelled with him last week, though he insists it was over a matter of local charity funds." "How very civic-minded of them both," Miss Marple murmured, stirring her tea. "And yet one wonders what sort of charity begins with an argument and ends with a corpse." Craddock smiled despite himself. "You have a way of putting things, Miss Marple. But yes, there's something off about the whole affair." The doctor's report came in. Death between 4:45 and 5. Cause, single blow from a blunt object, possibly a walking stick or a piece of iron pipe. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "A walking stick, you say? I noticed one by the body. Rather fine, with a silver handle." "Yes, and it belonged to Quill himself. Clean as a whistle, not a speck of blood." "That's always suspicious, don't you think?" she said, eyes twinkling faintly. "Cleanliness can be such a deceptive thing, Inspector, particularly when applied after the fact." He chuckled, rising to leave. "You'd have made a fine detective, Miss Marple, if you hadn't chosen crime-solving as a hobby." "Oh, but it isn't a hobby," she said quietly, setting her cup down. "It's an observation of character, and that, you see, is never out of season." When the door had closed, Miss Marple sat for some time in silence, her gaze resting on the ticking clock above her mantel. It seemed to her that clocks had suddenly become rather untrustworthy things in St. Mary Mead. They measured time well enough, but not truth. That afternoon she walked to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement received her warmly, though still shaken. "Jane, my dear, this dreadful business. Poor Leonard Quill. Who would do such a thing?" "Someone who knew him better than they pretended," Miss Marple said simply. "I should like to ask, did Mr. Quill ever visit the church tower?" "The tower? Good heavens, no. Why ever would he?" Miss Marple's fingers played with the fringe of her shawl. "That's just it. He wouldn't. Which means whoever struck him there knew the place well. Perhaps someone involved in the clock maintenance or with access to it. I wonder, has the clock been serviced recently?" Mrs. Clement thought for a moment. "Not since last autumn, though I believe Major Pritchard oversaw the repairs then. He's on the parish council, you know." "Yes, I know," Miss Marple said softly. "He does like to keep his hands busy, especially when there's machinery involved." Before evening fell, a sudden excitement rippled through the village once more. Young Tommy Pierce, still flushed with pride from having discovered the body, had found something else, a small brass winding key lying beneath the yew hedge near the clock tower. Inspector Craddock arrived promptly, examining the object under his torchlight. "Clock key," he said at once, "and a fresh smear of grease. Someone used this yesterday." Miss Marple, who had appeared as quietly as dusk itself, looked down at the key without speaking. Then, with her usual mildness, she said, "Time, it seems, is once again the heart of the matter. I dare say our murderer knew precisely when to stop it. And perhaps, Inspector, why?" Craddock gave her a sharp glance. "You think the clock was stopped deliberately?" "I should be very surprised if it wasn't," she said. "In my experience, when people tamper with time, it's not to change the past, but to disguise the present." And as the church bells tolled the hour, 6 perfectly punctual, Miss Marple turned toward the tower, her eyes calm and penetrating. Somewhere amid the gears and dust, between the tick of truth and the talk of deceit, she felt the faint echo of human folly. She had seen it before, and she would see it again. But never, she thought, quite in this way. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead had settled into that curious hush which always follows a scandal, when the outward calm of routine conceals a feverish undercurrent of speculation. The mist of the previous day had lifted, leaving the village green bright and deceptively peaceful. But for those who passed the clock tower, there was no longer comfort in its familiar presence. The hands had been reset, the clock ticking once more, yet every chime seemed faintly accusatory, as though marking not the hours, but the secrets hidden within them. Inspector Craddock had established his temporary headquarters in the small reading room beside the vicarage. Miss Marple, having been invited to take tea purely for moral support, as he phrased it, arrived promptly at 10. She found the inspector leaning over a spread of papers, his expression one of concentrated irritation. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, glancing up. "Do sit down. I've been going over the statements again, and the more I read them, the less sense they make. Everyone claims to have seen or heard nothing useful, which, as you and I both know, is almost never true." Miss Marple smiled faintly as she took her seat. "In a village, Inspector, people always see and hear far too much. The trouble is, they rarely notice what matters." Craddock gave a short laugh. "You may have something there. Take Major Pritchard, for instance. He swears he was at home all afternoon polishing his medals. His housekeeper confirms it, though she also admits she went to the shops for an hour about 4:30. "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "So he was alone at precisely the right time to commit a murder." "Quite so. And then there's Mrs. Bantry, who insists she saw him walking toward the green at 5:05. Of course, she may be mistaken about the time, but she's very firm on the point that he was carrying something wrapped in a cloth. Says it looked like a parcel, but heavy." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and regarded him with mild interest. "The Major is a man of habits, Inspector. He carries his walking stick everywhere, but a parcel. That's rather out of character. Did she mention what color the cloth was?" "Dark blue with a red stripe." Craddock looked up from his notes. "Matches the torn piece we found by the body." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap. "Yes, that is rather suggestive, isn't it? And yet I can't help thinking, if Major Pritchard had truly committed the deed, he would have found a neater way to conceal it. He prides himself on discipline. Murder is rarely tidy, but the Major, he would have tried to make it so." Craddock frowned. "Then what's your theory?" "Oh, I don't have one," she said mildly. "Not yet. I prefer to think of human motives before mechanical ones. Clocks, keys, watches. All those are merely props in the little drama. It's the actors who interest me." At that moment, a knock came at the door, and Briggs entered, cap in hand. "Begging your pardon, sir, but the doctor sent over something odd. He says he found traces of oil on the victim's right sleeve, same sort as the grease on the clock mechanism." "Oil?" Craddock's eyes sharpened. So Quill had been up the tower himself? "Looks that way, sir." Miss Marple set her knitting down. "That is curious indeed. I can't imagine Mr. Quill climbing that steep staircase voluntarily. He was rather frail, wasn't he?" "Yes, arthritis in both knees," Craddock said. "According to the doctor, he couldn't have managed the ladder unaided, which means someone must have helped him or taken him up there against his will." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Perhaps both, but why would he be up there at all? Unless, of course, he meant to meet someone privately." "Private enough place for it," Craddock agreed grimly. "Briggs, find out who's got keys to the tower. Vicar, sexton, maybe someone else." As the constable left, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window where the tower rose above the village rooftops, its stone face expressionless. "You know, Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "there's something rather symbolic about that clock. Always looking down, measuring everyone's lives in neat little ticks and tocks, until someone, one day, decides to stop it altogether." Craddock smiled. "You're getting poetic on me, Miss Marple." "Not poetic, Inspector," she replied softly. "Merely observant. Time stopped for Mr. Quill, not because the clock failed, but because someone wanted it to, and that someone, I fear, understood him very well. That afternoon, Miss Marple took it upon herself to visit Major Pritchard's residence, a tidy Georgian house at the edge of the village. The Major himself received her with exaggerated politeness, though his complexion was pallid and his manner restless. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, offering her a seat. "Terrible business, that fellow Quill. Can't say I knew him well. Foreign habits, peculiar ways. Still, no one deserves to die like that." "I quite agree," Miss Marple said mildly, accepting her tea. "I understand you and Mr. Quill had a disagreement last week." The Major stiffened. "Good heavens, who told you that?" "Oh, Mrs. Bantry, no doubt. The woman's a menace. Yes, we had words, but nothing serious. A dispute over committee funds. Quill had some foolish notion about diverting money to repair the clock tower. Waste of time, if you ask me." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "And yet it seems he may have gone up there himself on the day he died." The Major's cup rattled faintly in its saucer. "Up the tower? Nonsense. The man could barely climb a flight of stairs." "So I thought. Which makes it most puzzling. Someone must have persuaded him." He stared at her, eyes narrowing. "Are you implying that I—" "Oh dear, not at all," she said sweetly. "I was merely wondering what might persuade such a cautious man to climb somewhere so unsafe. Fear, perhaps, or trust." "Trust," he repeated, his tone sharp. "Yes, we do the strangest things for people we trust, even foolish things." For a moment, the Major's lips parted as though to speak, then pressed shut again. He rose abruptly. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I've pressing matters to attend to." As she made her way home, Miss Marple pondered his reaction. The Major's agitation was not that of a guilty man, she thought, but of one concealing something shameful, something that had little to do with murder but might lead, indirectly, to it. That evening, the sound of the clock striking 6 echoed over the village once more. Miss Marple stood by her garden gate, listening. The chime was slightly uneven now, a faint hesitation between the notes, as though the mechanism, recently disturbed, had not yet regained its rhythm. "Even clocks have memories," she murmured. "They mark the truth of what has been done, even when men try to hide it." Behind her, the faint crunch of gravel announced a visitor. Inspector Craddock appeared, looking weary. "More questions than answers, I'm afraid," he said. "We've found fingerprints on the clock key. 2 sets. One's Quill's, the other still unidentified." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "Unidentified, you say? Perhaps not for long. You might check whether the vicar's sexton, Mr. Jarvis, has been to the tower recently. He's fond of mechanical things, isn't he?" Craddock's eyes brightened. "That's right. Jarvis serviced the church organ last week, and he's on the parish payroll. You think he's involved?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think, Inspector, that people who understand how to keep time running are often the same ones who know exactly how to stop it. And I should very much like to speak with Mr. Jarvis before the next chime of the hour." The wind stirred the ivy along the tower, and for a fleeting moment the shadow of its hands fell across Miss Marple's face, like the faint trace of a secret slowly taking shape. The following day dawned crisp and clear, a deceptive serenity resting over St. Mary Mead like a well-tucked blanket hiding the fever beneath. The villagers moved about their morning errands with forced normalcy, but behind every polite greeting lurked a question. Who had killed Mr. Quill, and why? The church clock had been repaired and resumed its steady chime, yet each stroke seemed to echo the tension that rippled through the air. Inspector Craddock was already at the vicarage, poring over a list of names when Constable Briggs returned from the rectory with news. "I've spoken to the sexton, sir. Mr. Jarvis. Says he hadn't been near the tower in over a fortnight. Claims he lent the spare key to Mr. Quill himself for some inspection business." Craddock looked up sharply. "Mr. Quill asked for the key?" "That's right, sir. Said he wanted to check the clock weights. something about hearing a rattle at night. Miss Marple, who had quietly entered the room a moment earlier with a small basket of scones, paused in setting them down. "Now that is very interesting," she said softly. "You see, Mr. Quill was not the sort of man to concern himself with rattling weights. I doubt he would know the difference between a pendulum and a pulpit." Craddock turned toward her. "Then someone else must have wanted him up there." "Yes," she replied, settling into a chair. "And whoever arranged it did so in such a way that he thought it perfectly harmless. An appointment, perhaps? Something that gave him confidence rather than alarm." Craddock frowned, considering. "So you think the meeting was planned?" "I think it must have been. People seldom wander into their own murders by accident, Inspector." Before he could reply, Briggs returned with another note in hand. "From the postmistress, sir. She says she's found something while sorting yesterday's letters. One for Mr. Quill that never got collected." Craddock tore open the envelope carefully. The letter inside was brief, typed on ordinary paper. "Mr. Quill, I must speak with you privately at 5 o'clock by the tower. It concerns your correspondence from Switzerland. I believe we can reach an understanding." It was unsigned. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Ah, that fits rather neatly, doesn't it? He would have gone willingly, especially if he believed someone threatened to reveal his secrets." "You think blackmail?" Craddock asked. "It has a very particular ring to it," she murmured. "People who live alone, Inspector, often carry secrets like hidden heirlooms, wrapped in dustcloth and gilt. Mr. Quill was no exception. The foreign letters, the solitude, it all suggests a man with a past he wished to keep tidy." Craddock nodded grimly. "And whoever wrote this knew it. We'll have the letter checked for fingerprints, but I'll wager the writer was clever enough to avoid leaving any." "Clever, yes," Miss Marple said, her tone musing. "But even clever people make mistakes when emotion enters the equation. Murder, after all, is rarely a cold-blooded thing. It's often done in haste, by someone whose heart beat a little too quickly for their reason." The inspector regarded her thoughtfully. "You have someone in mind?" "I have several," she admitted with a small smile. "But I find it best to let them reveal themselves. People are remarkably obliging when it comes to self-betrayal." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk through the churchyard, where the autumn air carried the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. The clock tower loomed above, its long shadow stretching across the gravestones. She paused at the base, peering at the worn steps. There, half hidden in the dirt, was something glinting faintly. She stooped, plucking up a small metal button, military in design, dull with age yet unmistakable in pattern. She held it in her palm, her brows knitting in quiet reflection. "Major Pritchard again," she murmured to herself. Or perhaps someone who wanted it to seem so. Her thoughts were interrupted by a shuffling sound. Mr. Jarvis, the sexton, emerged from behind the tower, cap in hand. "Morning, Miss Marple. Awful business, this. Never thought such wickedness could happen here." "No," she agreed softly. "Though wickedness, like mildew, tends to grow best in damp, familiar corners." Jarvis chuckled awkwardly. "Aye, that's true enough. I've been checking the clock since the inspector's men came through. Nothing wrong with it now. Still, strange thing. Someone's been oiling it with foreign stuff. Not what I use. Smells different, almost sweet." Miss Marple's expression sharpened slightly. "Foreign oil, you say? How curious. Perhaps Mr. Quill had some sent from abroad, though why he would bother with such detail is beyond me." Jarvis scratched his chin. "Didn't strike me as the sort, and whoever used it did a sloppy job, spilled a bit near the gears. I wiped it off, but you could still smell it if you're close enough." Miss Marple thanked him kindly, then turned toward the path. As she walked away, she turned the button over once more in her fingers, the faintly embossed crown catching the light. It told a story, if one cared to listen. A story of rank, of pride, of someone who lived in habits of precision. That evening, Miss Marple invited Mrs. Bantry for tea. The older woman arrived, flustered and eager, her curiosity plainly aflame. "Oh, Jane, do tell me, is it true the police think the Major did it? They say his temper's dreadful when provoked, and you know how he was about that money business." Miss Marple poured tea calmly. "The police are considering all possibilities. But tempers, dear Dolly, are like wasps. They sting more often in self-defense than attack." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Self-defense? You mean Mr. Quill might have attacked him?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I mean only that we must be careful with assumptions. The truth tends to hide behind manners, and St. Mary Mead has very good manners indeed." The next morning, news broke that the results from the letter analysis were back. No fingerprints. The typewriter used was an old Remington, common enough, but the ink ribbon bore traces of red correction dye, used by one person in the village, Miss Emily Price, the postmistress. Inspector Craddock wasted no time calling on her, and Miss Marple accompanied him under the guise of moral encouragement. Mrs. Price, normally the embodiment of brisk composure, turned quite pale when confronted with the evidence. "Well, yes, I typed it." I stammered, "but not to harm him, Inspector. He'd been getting those letters for months, and I knew something wasn't right. I only wanted to frighten him into telling the truth." "What truth?" Craddock demanded. "That he wasn't really retired from the Foreign Office. He'd been in some scandal, something to do with stolen papers years ago. I overheard a bit once when he argued with the Major outside my shop." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "So you wrote him anonymously, hoping to draw him out. But he met someone that day, didn't he?" "Yes," Mrs. Price whispered. "But it wasn't me. I swear it. I never went near the tower." Craddock exchanged a look with Miss Marple. The postmistress's guilt seemed real, but her fear was of conscience, not discovery. As they left the post office, Miss Marple sighed softly. "You see, Inspector," she said, "we have the spark that lit the match, but not the hand that struck it." Craddock frowned. "Then who did?" Miss Marple looked up at the clock tower, its hands pointing serenely to noon. "Someone who understood the power of appearances. Someone who wanted Mr. Quill silenced, but also wanted the village to look at the wrong man. And I think, Inspector, we are about to discover just how precise that deception was." As the bells began their steady peal, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the tower's narrow windows. Somewhere within the ticking mechanism of that clock, perhaps in a gear, perhaps in the silence between them, she could almost hear the faint whisper of truth preparing to speak. The following morning broke under a low grey sky, the kind that pressed heavily over the village rooftops, dulling even the sound of the birds. The tension that had begun as whispers now moved through St. Mary Mead with the pulse of something almost tangible. People lowered their voices in doorways, peered through curtains, and the clock towers tolling felt more mournful than ever. Inspector Craddock, meanwhile, sat in the vicar's study with his coat off and his brow furrowed, a half-empty cup of tea cooling beside him. He had slept poorly, his mind circling the same questions like a dog chasing its tail. Miss Marple arrived unannounced, her expression mild, but her eyes bright with thought. "Good morning, Inspector. I thought you might appreciate a fresh mind, or at least a fresh pot of tea." He managed a tired smile. "You must be a mind reader, Miss Marple. I've been going round in circles. We've a half-dozen motives, a dozen theories, and not a single solid fact that points cleanly to the killer." But facts have a way of hiding behind behavior," she said gently, pouring him a new cup. "You're thinking too much about evidence and not enough about character." Craddock sighed. "Perhaps you're right. But consider the situation. The postmistress admits to writing the letter. Quill goes to the tower at 5. He's struck dead. The clock stopped, and somehow we're meant to believe it's all coincidence. We've found the Major's button and traces of that foreign oil, but none of it fits neatly together." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Nothing ever does at first. The world, you see, doesn't arrange itself for the convenience of policemen." He chuckled, despite himself. "Then what do you make of it, Miss Marple? Who do you think our clock stopper is?" She didn't answer at once. Her eyes drifted toward the window, where the tower's grey outline loomed faintly through the mist. "I think," she said slowly, "that we've all been looking in the wrong direction. We've thought of who killed Mr. Quill, but not of why he died just then, at precisely that hour. Why 5 o'clock, Inspector? Why not 4:30 or 5:15? Time, I believe, is our clue." Craddock frowned thoughtfully. "You think the time itself was significant?" "I do. Someone wanted the murder to appear to have taken place at that very moment. And yet the clock had been tampered with. It stopped exactly at 5. That tells me the killer cared less about the act itself than the impression it gave." He leaned back, nodding slowly. "So you're saying the time was meant to mislead us?" "Precisely," she said, eyes twinkling. "But the question is, mislead us into what?" There was a knock at the door. Briggs entered, slightly out of breath, holding a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Post came early, sir. Addressed to Mr. Leonard Quill, but it was found at the post office this morning. Seems it was missed yesterday." Craddock took the parcel, unwrapping it carefully. Inside lay a small metal canister, its label faded but still legible. Horowitz Precision Oil, Zurich. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Ah, so our foreign oil has made another appearance, and mailed from Switzerland, no less. How very neat." Craddock examined it. "You think it's the same oil used on the clock mechanism?" "I'd wager so," she said softly. "Mr. Quill must have received it recently, though I dare say he wasn't the one who applied it. It's quite possible someone intercepted his parcel, or even helped him open it, under the pretense of concern for his rattling clock." Craddock frowned. "Meaning whoever killed him had access to both his post and his confidence." "Exactly. And those are privileges few people enjoy in a small village, unless they make themselves appear helpful." There was a pause while the inspector digested this. Outside, the first drops of rain began to tap softly against the window pane. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was already fitting together fragments like an intricate jigsaw. Mr. Quill's reclusive habits, the foreign correspondence, the button by the tower, the postmistress's misguided letter, and now the oil. It was all there, she felt, only hidden beneath the pleasant surface of village decency. She rose quietly. "I think, Inspector, it might be time to pay a call on our sexton once more. I've always found that those who keep the keys, literally and otherwise, often hold more than they realize." They found Mr. Jarvis in the churchyard, stooped over a spade, turning the damp soil by the lich gate. His manner was as mild as ever, but his eyes flickered uneasily when Craddock approached. "Morning, sir." "Morning, Miss Marple. Can't be too careful with the ground this time of year. Roots grow wild if you don't mind 'em." "I imagine so," Miss Marple said kindly. "And yet one wonders whether roots are the only things that grow wild in St. Mary Mead these days." The sexton gave an awkward chuckle. "Ah, that's true enough. Terrible business, poor Mr. Quill." Craddock wasted no time. "We've had some new information, Jarvis. Seems Mr. Quill had the clock oil sent from abroad. You wouldn't happen to know who used it last, would you?" Jarvis hesitated, his hand tightening on the spade. "Can't say I do, sir. I told you, I hadn't touched the mechanism in weeks." Miss Marple's tone was gentle, almost sympathetic. "It must be difficult, keeping up with the tower. So much responsibility, and so many people who come and go. I suppose Mr. Quill was quite insistent about seeing it." Jarvis swallowed. "Said he wanted to check something himself. I told him to wait till I could go with him, but he wouldn't hear of it. Proud sort he was." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Did anyone else know about his visit?" Jarvis hesitated again. Too long. "Maybe the Major. He was asking after the clock that morning, said it hadn't chimed properly the night before. Couldn't hurt to tell him, I thought. Miss Marple exchanged a fleeting glance with Craddock. And did the Major seem surprised when you mentioned Mr. Quill's plan? The sexton wiped his brow. Can't rightly say. He just nodded and said he'd be keeping an eye on the matter. I thought he meant the council meeting later. Miss Marple's voice softened even further, her eyes almost kindly. Mr. Jarvis, do you know what I've always found remarkable about secrets? The way they burden the good more than the wicked. You've been uneasy ever since this happened. Jarvis's face drained of color. I've told you all I know, Miss Marple. I swear it. Oh, I think you've told us quite a bit, she said, her tone still calm. You've told us you lent the key, that someone used oil they shouldn't have had, and that the Major was conveniently informed of Mr. Quill's visit. The only thing you haven't told us is whether you heard the clock stop, or helped it do so. Jarvis's hand trembled on the spade. For a moment it seemed he might speak, but instead he muttered, "You can't prove nothing," and turned abruptly toward the gate. Craddock started after him, but Miss Marple laid a hand on his arm. "Let him go, Inspector. He's frightened, but not of the law. Of someone else. We must give him time, ironically enough, for the truth to strike." That evening, the rain fell harder, and the wind rattled the ivy along the church walls. Miss Marple sat by her hearth, knitting quietly, her thoughts threading themselves into order. She knew now that the clock had not merely been stopped to confuse time of death. It had been stopped to mark it falsely. Whoever killed Leonard Quill wanted to create an alibi that would stand on the face of the very clock that governed the village's trust. And as the hour struck 9, steady and precise, Miss Marple whispered to herself, "When one sets time to deceive, one must live by its rhythm. And that, Inspector, is where you will find your murderer, trapped between the truth and the tick." The rain continued through the night, falling in a steady whisper that blanketed St. Mary Mead in a somber quiet. By morning, the air was cool and heavy, and the earth smelled of wet leaves and secrets long buried. The church tower rose through the mist like a sentinel, its clock face glistening faintly in the pale light. From Miss Marple's cottage window, it looked almost watchful, like a witness that had seen more than it ought. Miss Marple herself had risen early. She sat by the fire with her knitting, the rhythmic click of needles blending with a faint drip from the eaves outside. Her mind moved far faster than her hands. Every detail of the previous day, Jarvis's nervousness, the foreign oil, the letter, the curious precision of the clock's stoppage, turned in her thoughts like a wheel finding its groove. Something about the pattern of it all was wrong, too neat, as if deliberately arranged, and that was precisely what made it so revealing. A knock came at her door just after 9. It was Inspector Craddock, looking more awake than usual, though the lines on his forehead spoke of little sleep. "Morning, Miss Marple. You were right about Jarvis. He's gone missing." She looked up calmly. "Missing, Inspector? Or perhaps just frightened into hiding?" "Could be either," he said grimly, stepping inside. "His landlady says he left before dawn, said he had business in Much Benham, but there's no sign of him on the road. And his spade's still by the church." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Fear often makes people foolish, Inspector. Running only makes them easier to follow." He gave a weary smile. "You make it sound simple." "It usually is," she said, setting her knitting aside. "People don't vanish without help. If he's hiding, someone knows where. The question is, who stands to gain by his silence?" Craddock began pacing before the fire. "If Jarvis is mixed up in this, we'll find out soon enough. But I'll admit something's bothering me. The vicar swears the clock chimed at exactly 5 that afternoon, which would mean it was working then, but, according to the doctor, Quill was dead by 5. So either the doctor's wrong about the time, or the chime was staged." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly. "A chime can be set to ring, Inspector, even if the clock itself has stopped. I suspect our murderer knew that, and used it cleverly. The sound of the bell at 5 would make everyone believe Quill died then. It gives the killer an alibi if they were seen elsewhere afterward. Craddock stopped pacing. Good Lord, so whoever did it must have tampered with the mechanism beforehand. Quite so. Which brings us back to someone who understood its workings and had reason to ensure no one questioned the hour. Craddock rubbed his chin. Jarvis knew the clock, of course, but so did Major Pritchard. He oversaw the repairs, and now Jarvis is gone. You think the Major might have frightened him into running? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She stood, moving to the window where the rain streaked down the glass in narrow threads. Major Pritchard is a man of habit and pride. He likes things orderly, particularly his reputation. He's not the sort to strike from passion, but from necessity, perhaps. Tell me, Inspector, did you ever find out why he and Mr. Quill quarreled? Craddock sighed. He admitted they argued about charity funds. Claims Quill accused him of mismanaging money, but there's no proof. I checked the accounts. Everything's in order. Too much in order, perhaps, Miss Marple said softly. When things are spotless, Inspector, one must look for what's been scrubbed away. He gave her a sharp look. You think the Major was covering something? I think, she replied, that Mr. Quill had discovered something, and someone knew he meant to reveal it. The letter from the postmistress may have brought him to the tower, but I suspect another letter, one we haven't yet seen, is what sealed his fate. Craddock frowned. Another letter? Yes. You see, Inspector, blackmailers seldom begin with confrontation. They start with hints, and men like Leonard Quill, men who've lived under shadows, tend to keep their incriminating papers close. I wonder where he kept his. Before he could answer, there came a knock at the door. Briggs entered, soaked through and looking uneasy. Begging your pardon, sir, but they've found something. Behind Ivy Cottage in the shed. Looks like old Mr. Quill had a sort of hiding place. Craddock straightened at once. Show me. Miss Marple followed, fastening her shawl against the drizzle. The path to Ivy Cottage was slick with mud, and the small shed behind it leaned slightly to one side, its door hanging loose on the hinge. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil, dust, and decay. On the workbench lay a small tin box, pried open, its contents scattered. Craddock examined the papers quickly, letters in foreign script, official-looking envelopes, and a few receipts. One caught his attention. Look at this. Payment received by one C. Jarvis for maintenance and overtime, tower repairs, December. Signed by the Major himself. Miss Marple's eyes lit with quiet understanding. Oh my, how very instructive. What do you mean? Craddock asked. Why, Inspector, that tells us precisely what sort of relationship those two men had. The Major paid Jarvis privately for work that should have been done through the parish accounts. That suggests something to hide. Perhaps not money, but action. Craddock frowned. You mean the Major used Jarvis to do something off the books? Indeed. Perhaps he had the clock altered in some small but useful way. Something unnoticed until it became convenient. And then, when Mr. Quill began asking questions, the truth grew dangerous. As she spoke, Briggs, who had been rummaging near the shelves, gave a startled exclamation. Sir, there's blood on this cloth. They hurried over. It was a piece of dark blue fabric, faintly stained and torn, the missing half of the fragment found near the body. Craddock looked grim. That clinches it. This came from the Major's coat. Miss Marple, however, was not so easily satisfied. She bent over the cloth, touching the frayed edge. Yes, but notice the thread, Inspector. Black, coarse, uneven. Mended by hand, not tailor's work. The Major's wife mends neatly. I've seen her do it. This patching is clumsy, recent, done by someone who doesn't usually sew. You think it was planted? I think, she said slowly, that someone wanted it to seem like the Major's coat. There are only two men who could have done so. one who wore the coat and one who kept it. Craddock's eyes widened. Jarvis. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Jarvis, who had access to the Major's things when assisting with the repairs and who would know the clock's workings well enough to tamper with it. But he was no killer by nature. I imagine someone persuaded him, someone who promised him money or protection and then made certain he could never speak. The inspector exhaled heavily. You mean Jarvis might have been blackmailed into helping and then silenced? Perhaps not silenced yet, she said quietly. But soon, if we don't find him first. The person behind this will not leave loose ends. That afternoon, word spread that a man's coat had been found snagged by the riverbank a mile from the village. Craddock and his men hurried to the scene, and Miss Marple followed, her heart heavy with certainty. The coat belonged to Jarvis, and beside it, half buried in the mud, was the church key, the one for the tower. Craddock swore softly under his breath. He's either drowned or hiding in panic. Either way, someone drove him there. Miss Marple stared down at the key, its metal dull with river grime. Driven by guilt, yes, but not his own. The clock stopped for Leonard Quill, Inspector. But I rather think time is about to catch up with the one who wound it. And as the wind lifted across the wet grass, carrying with it the distant chime of the clock tower, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the river's dark surface. Somewhere, beneath that calm, truth was beginning to rise. The river ran slow that morning, a murky ribbon winding through the low fields beyond St. Mary Mead. The mist had lifted, but left behind a faint silver haze that softened the outlines of the hedgerows and blurred the boundary between water and sky. Inspector Craddock stood at the bank, boots sunk in mud, gazing grimly at the spot where Jarvis's coat had been found. His men combed the reeds with poles, their movements methodical and silent, except for the faint splash of water. Miss Marple, standing a little way off beneath her umbrella, watched the slow sweep of the river with calm but unblinking eyes. No body had yet surfaced, though that did not seem to surprise her. The current is slow but sure, Inspector, she said quietly. If he fell in near here, he may be lodged further down where the bend narrows. Or, of course, he may not be in the river at all. Craddock glanced at her sharply. You think he's alive? I think, she replied, that men who run from fear often choose cleverer hiding places than rivers. A drowning is convenient for those who wish the world to believe a story, especially when it saves them the trouble of explaining what became of a troublesome accomplice. The inspector nodded grimly. You believe Jarvis was forced into helping with the murder? Persuaded, yes. Forced, perhaps later. Someone needed him to alter the clock, to set it to chime falsely, and to keep silent afterward. But once the deed was done, silence became dangerous, for both of them. Craddock sighed. Then we're looking at someone ruthless enough to kill twice. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes softened with something almost like sorrow. It's not ruthlessness that drives such acts, Inspector. It's fear. Fear of losing something dearer than a life. Respectability, position, the illusion of innocence. The inspector's reply was cut short by a shout from one of the constables downstream. Sir, over here. They hurried along the bank to where the man stood pointing at a small wooden jetty half hidden by willows. Beneath it, tangled in the roots, something pale showed against the dark water. It was Jarvis. They drew him out gently. His face was gray and slack, but the bruising at his temple told its story plainly. Craddock bent to examine him, grimacing. Struck before he went into the water. No accident. Miss Marple stood silent for a moment, her hands folded before her. Poor man. He was never meant for deception. It weighs too heavily on simple souls. Craddock looked up at her. You said he might not be dead. I wish you'd been right. Oh, I still think she said softly. You see, the man who truly died yesterday was not Jarvis at all, but the one who believed his secret would remain buried. That's the death that always follows such crimes, the moral one. Back in the village, the news spread with swift inevitability. By midday, every housewife and gardener in St. Mary Mead knew that Jarvis had been found dead, and the air buzzed with speculation. Some said he'd confessed and thrown himself into the river. Others whispered that the Major had helped him along. Miss Marple let the gossip swirl unchecked, for gossip, she knew, was often a form of revelation. It loosened tongues that official questions only tightened. By late afternoon, she found herself once more in the vicar's study, where Craddock had laid out the latest evidence. Beside the river, mud-stained quay, lay a new discovery. A small envelope taken from Jarvis's coat pocket, the paper warped with damp. The inspector had opened it carefully, spreading it flat. Inside was a single sheet bearing only one line in a firm, deliberate hand. "You did well. Collect your payment tomorrow as agreed." Craddock tapped it with his pen. No signature, of course, but the papers of fine quality, expensive, the sort sold at the stationer's in Much Benham. Could belong to anyone. "Not to anyone," Miss Marple murmured, studying it. "To someone accustomed to business correspondence, I think. The hand is practiced, controlled, but not quite impersonal. And the phrasing, 'Collect your payment tomorrow as agreed.' That implies prior arrangement. Someone planned this transaction carefully." Craddock sat back. "You think it was the Major?" "I think Major Pritchard was convenient," she said gently. "He was made to appear guilty from the beginning. The quarrel, the button, the coat cloth, all point too neatly to him. Too perfectly, one might say. Real guilt is rarely so considerate to the investigator." The inspector frowned. "Then who planted the evidence?" "Someone who knew both men," Miss Marple replied, "and who understood how the village mind works, the sort who could nudge a rumor here, a suspicion there, until everyone's imagination did the rest. Tell me, Inspector, who was first to mention the Major's quarrel with Mr. Quill?" Craddock thought for a moment. "Mrs. Price, the postmistress." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And who handled Mr. Quill's letters from Switzerland, who saw the addresses, and perhaps learned more than she should?" "The postmistress again," Craddock admitted. "But she confessed to writing the anonymous letter. She said she only wanted to scare him, not kill him." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "and I believe that. She's vain, not wicked. But vanity makes people easy to use. Someone encouraged her suspicions, perhaps even hinted that Mr. Quill was a spy or a thief. It would be simple enough to manipulate her into writing that note, then use it to lure Mr. Quill into the trap." Craddock's gaze sharpened. "And who would have known that? Who would benefit from Quill's death?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Who indeed? Think, Inspector. Mr. Quill was once a civil servant, quietly receiving payments from abroad. Someone here knew his secret and exploited it. Jarvis was drawn in to stage the scene, the clock, the chime, the false evidence. But once the deception succeeded, Jarvis became a liability. And as for who arranged it all, one must ask who was closest to both Mr. Quill and the post office, who could intercept letters, send parcels, and even redirect them without question. Craddock froze. "You mean someone inside the postal system?" "Precisely. Not Mrs. Price. She's too loud for such cunning. But her assistant, Miss Lydia Kane. Quiet, efficient, unnoticed. She has handled the foreign post for months." He blinked. "I'll be damned. I barely remember seeing her." "That is her advantage," Miss Marple said. "People rarely suspect the quiet ones. But I recall her once at the market, buying that same brand of Swiss oil for her brother's bicycle. And she lives only 3 doors from the Major, does she not?" Craddock stood abruptly, the chair scraping the floor. "By heaven, if you're right." "I usually am, Inspector," she said mildly, gathering her shawl. "But do be careful. A cornered woman is a dangerous creature. and Miss Kane has had years of practice listening unseen. They found Lydia Kane that evening at the post office, sorting the last of the mail. She looked up when the doorbell chimed, her eyes widening at the sight of the inspector and Miss Marple behind him, serene as ever. "Miss Kane," Craddock began, "we'd like to ask you a few questions about Mr. Quill's correspondence." Her hands hesitated over the letters for a fraction of a second, then resumed, steady and calm. "Of course, Inspector. Anything to help." Miss Marple's voice was soft but unrelenting. "It's difficult, isn't it, Miss Kane, when one's kindness to a frightened man leads to such dreadful consequences. Mr. Quill trusted you, didn't he? You read his letters to him sometimes. You knew what was at stake." For the first time, a flicker of panic crossed Lydia's face. I don't know what you mean." "Oh, but you do," Miss Marple said gently. "You knew about the money from Switzerland, and you knew the Major's name appeared in those letters once. You saw a way to profit from it, and to rid yourself of a man who might expose you. You enlisted poor Jarvis, promised him payment, and when he realized what you'd done, you silenced him too." Lydia's composure faltered, her eyes darting toward the counter drawer. Craddock's hand moved swiftly to his revolver. "Don't," he said sharply. The room went still except for the ticking of the clock above the counter, a cruelly ordinary sound. Lydia's shoulders sagged, the strength draining from her. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," she whispered. "He wasn't meant to die. I only wanted him frightened, but he threatened me. Said he'd tell everything." Miss Marple's expression was almost tender. "And so you struck him. And when Jarvis began to waver, you struck again. The clock, of course, told the tale. You wanted it to mark the hour of your alibi, didn't you?" Lydia's eyes filled with tears. It was only supposed to be a warning. Craddock took her arm firmly, guiding her toward the door. Miss Marple watched in silence, her face unreadable. When they were gone, she stood for a long moment alone in the little shop, the clock ticking behind her, steady and remorseless. Then she turned down the light and stepped outside, the chill evening air brushing her cheek. Across the green, the church tower loomed, its clock hands gleaming faintly against the sky. It struck the hour, 8, perfectly punctual once more. Miss Marple paused, listening to the echo fade. "Time always tells the truth," she murmured to herself, "if one only knows how to listen." The following morning, St. Mary Mead woke to the subdued hum that always followed a scandal's crest. Rain-washed streets gleamed faintly under the pale sun, and the gossip that had filled every drawing room the day before now softened into something like uneasy reflection. The news of Lydia Kane's arrest had spread quickly, though few could believe it at first. Miss Kane, quiet and modest, with her soft voice and unassuming manners, she had seemed as much a fixture of the village as the church tower itself. Yet beneath that calm exterior, a darker current had flowed unseen, like the slow, patient pull of the river that had swallowed poor Jarvis. Miss Marple, walking up the lane toward the vicarage that morning, carried with her the same calm expression she always wore, though her mind was still turning over details as delicately as a seamstress inspecting a fine stitch. Crimes, she often thought, were much like embroidery. The pattern revealed itself only when one stood back far enough to see the whole. The threads might tangle midway, but eventually order returned. Inspector Craddock met her at the vicar's door, looking both tired and grimly satisfied. "She's confessed, Miss Marple," he said at once, almost before greeting her. "Everything. It came out late last night after we brought her to Much Benham. She admitted to striking Quill. Said it was an accident, though of course it wasn't. Claimed she only meant to stop him from shouting. The quarrel got out of hand." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I thought it might have been so. A blow struck in fear often lands harder than one intended." Craddock rubbed the back of his neck. "She's a strange one. Cold, almost matter of fact. Said she never meant for Jarvis to die either, that he panicked, threatened to tell the police everything, so she went to meet him by the river to calm him down. Another accident, she says. The trouble is, Miss Marple, I think she half believes it. That's quite possible, said Miss Marple gently. People are very adept at deceiving themselves when remorse becomes inconvenient. They build little stories inside their minds until they forget where truth ends and invention begins. Craddock gave a short laugh without humor. I don't know how you can sound so calm after all this. Oh, but I'm not calm, Inspector, she replied softly. I'm quite sad. You see, Lydia Kane's crime was not born of greed alone. It was born of loneliness. She wanted security, admiration, perhaps even love. Those are very dangerous desires in people who have lived too long without them. He looked at her curiously. You really think she cared for Quill? Not in the romantic sense, perhaps, but there was a kind of fascination. He represented something beyond her little world, a man with secrets, a life connected to faraway places. It drew her in. When she discovered those Swiss payments, she must have seen both opportunity and power. But poor Mr. Quill, I dare say, saw only another threat to his fragile peace. They stepped inside the vicar's study, where the fire burned low and the smell of damp coats lingered. Mrs. Clement had left a pot of tea on the side table, along with a small plate of biscuits. Miss Marple poured for them both, the soft clink of china filling the thoughtful silence that followed. Craddock finally spoke again. We found the rest of the letters she'd taken from his cottage. Seems Quill was involved in some sort of post-war intelligence matter. Minor work, nothing treasonous. But it left him anxious, paranoid even. He believed people still watched him. Lydia probably saw those letters and thought she'd stumbled on espionage. She used them to squeeze him for money, then panicked when she realized the danger of her own scheme. Miss Marple nodded. Fear and imagination, an unfortunate pairing. It begins as curiosity, becomes manipulation, and ends in panic. Mr. Quill was too proud to beg for help, and Miss Kane too frightened to stop what she'd started. Craddock leaned back in his chair with a long exhale. I suppose that's the end of it then. 2 dead, 1 behind bars. The clock tower's running again, and life in St. Mary Mead will go on as though none of this ever happened. Miss Marple gave him a faint smile. Life always goes on, Inspector, but never quite the same. Villages remember in their own quiet ways. Every garden gate, every church pew, keeps a whisper of what's past. The gossip will fade, of course, but the story will settle into the soil, as all such things do. They sat a moment longer, the fire crackling softly. Outside, the church bell struck the half-hour, the sound bright and even once more. Craddock listened to it with a frown. I'll tell you something that's been bothering me, Miss Marple. The clock, the whole affair of it being stopped, then restarted, and the chime set deliberately wrong. Lydia admitted to planning the letter and arranging the meeting, but she swears she didn't touch the clock. Says Jarvis did that himself, on Quill's instruction. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly. Did she say why? Claims Quill wanted to test whether it could be made to strike at a specific minute, something about aligning it with his pocket watch. Sounded harmless enough. Harmless, Miss Marple murmured, setting down her teacup, is such a deceptive word, particularly when used by the dead. Craddock gave her a puzzled look. She rose slowly, adjusting her shawl. Inspector, I have a small favor to ask. Might we walk to the tower before luncheon? There's a tiny matter I'd like to see for myself. He agreed, though with mild reluctance. The path to the tower was still damp, and the air held that sharp edge of early autumn. When they reached it, Miss Marple paused at the base, looking up at the clock face glinting in the light. Then she pointed toward the narrow stone stairway that wound inside. Would you mind terribly leading the way, Inspector? I'll follow. The climb was close and echoing, the air smelling faintly of rust and oil. At the top, the mechanism ticked with slow precision, the heavy pendulum swinging in its measured arc. Miss Marple approached it carefully, her gloved hand tracing the edge of the brass casing. "You see there," she said, "that thin groove along the pendulum shaft? It's been filed down recently. And there, the lever for the chime is slightly bent. That wasn't done by accident." Craddock bent to look. "You think Jarvis did that?" "I think he did what he was told," she said. "But not by Mr. Quill. This was altered before the day of the murder, weeks before, perhaps. Someone wanted to ensure the clock could be stopped and restarted at will without breaking the mechanism. That takes foresight, Inspector." He stared at her. "Then the killing wasn't spontaneous. It was planned well in advance." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "but not by Lydia Kane. She was an opportunist, not an architect. No, I think someone else prepared the stage, and when she stumbled onto it, she merely followed the script already written." Craddock frowned. "You mean there was another hand in it?" "Perhaps not in the murder itself," she said, "but in its possibility. Some crimes begin long before they're committed, Inspector. Seeds planted by small deceptions or old resentments. Someone in this village knew what Mr. Quill feared most, and set events in motion, knowing fear would do the rest." They descended the steps in thoughtful silence. When they reached the green, the sound of children playing drifted faintly from the schoolyard beyond the hedges, a strangely ordinary sound after so much death. Miss Marple stood watching them for a moment, then turned to Craddock with a calm smile. "Let us not trouble ourselves with ghosts just yet, Inspector. Miss Kane's guilt will satisfy the law, even if it does not quite satisfy the truth. But you and I, well, we must sometimes make do with understanding." He looked at her uncertainly. "Do you mean there's still more to uncover?" "Oh, always," she said lightly. "Human nature is an untidy thing. It never ends where we think it should." As they walked back toward the village, the clock began to strike 12, each chime pure and deliberate. Miss Marple's pace slowed. "It's running well again," Craddock said absently. "Yes," she murmured, almost to herself. "Time, you see, has a remarkable talent for mending what men break, though it never forgets where the cracks are." And as they passed beneath the tower's long shadow, the faint echo of that thought seemed to linger, threading through the air like the last whisper of a story not yet finished. The evening sun fell low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden warmth across the green and softening the sharp edges of roofs and hedges. The rain of the previous days had left the air washed clean, carrying the faint fragrance of damp earth and chimney smoke. The village looked utterly peaceful again, as if the terrible events that had unsettled it were already slipping into memory. Yet Miss Marple, seated by her parlor window with her knitting in her lap, knew that memory in St. Mary Mead never truly faded. It merely grew quieter, like the ticking of a clock when the house has gone still. She had been expecting Inspector Craddock, and when he arrived at 6:30, she greeted him with her usual calm composure and a fresh pot of tea. He looked relieved, but still thoughtful. "I've just come from Much Benham," he said, settling into his chair. "Lydia Kane has signed her full confession. The Crown prosecutor's satisfied, and it will likely go to trial by winter. It's over, Miss Marple. You were right from the beginning." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking softly. "Oh, I'm glad justice has found its way, Inspector. Though, if I may say so, justice and truth are not always quite the same thing." Craddock frowned, puzzled. "You don't mean you still think she didn't do it?" "Oh, she did it, yes," Miss Marple said mildly. "But not alone in spirit, perhaps, and not entirely of her own making. She was what I'd call a catalyst, Inspector. A spark in dry straw. The real fire began much earlier." He leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "You mean Quill's past?" "Partly. Poor Mr. Quill's life was built upon secrets, and secrets have a dreadful way of drawing others to them, like moths to a lamp. He had been involved in small bureaucratic misdeeds long ago, nothing so grand as espionage, but shameful enough to haunt him. It left him vulnerable. He was a man afraid of exposure, and fear, Inspector, is a very contagious thing. She set her knitting aside, her blue eyes bright with quiet clarity. You see, someone else in the village discovered his secret long before Miss Kane did. Someone who held it over him, not for money, but for control. The Major, I think, realized that Mr. Quill's guilt could be useful. When he had that quarrel with him over parish funds, it was not about money at all, but about silence. Mr. Quill must have threatened to reveal something improper the Major had done years before, perhaps misappropriating a small sum from the council. The Major could not afford scandal, so he frightened Quill into obedience. It was the Major who had Jarvis alter the clock weeks in advance for some innocent maintenance, or so he claimed. But Quill's death, that came later, through Miss Kane's trembling hand. Still, the setting, the timing, the appearance of guilt, it was all shaped by a design already in place. Craddock's brow furrowed deeply. But you have no proof of that. Miss Marple smiled gently. Proof is a matter for courts, Inspector. Understanding is something quite different. The Major will live with what he knows, that his manipulations, his need for control, led directly to 2 deaths, and perhaps that will be punishment enough. Craddock was silent for a moment, watching the faint tremor of the firelight on her face. You really think he knows? Oh, yes, Miss Marple said softly. When men like the Major realize they've been the architects of their own ruin, they do not confess. They deteriorate, you'll see. He'll give up his committees, avoid the green, and one day you'll hear he's gone abroad for his health. But he'll never be quite the same. No one who's felt time stop around them ever is. She poured him another cup of tea, the steam curling upward between them. And Lydia Kane, she continued, will likely find peace of a sort. Prison can be surprisingly restful for certain souls. So many years spent pretending, and now she may simply be herself, even if only within walls. Craddock sighed. You have an uncanny way of making even tragedy sound. Almost merciful. Miss Marple chuckled softly. One learns, Inspector. Human beings are rarely wicked through and through. Mostly they are frightened or foolish or terribly lonely. If one understands that, the world grows a little less baffling. Outside, the church clock began to chime the hour, 7 clear notes drifting over the rooftops. Both of them paused to listen. The sound was steady now, confident, as though the great mechanism had shaken off the shadow of its dark association. Craddock smiled faintly. I'll never hear that clock again without thinking of this case. Nor should you, Miss Marple said. It has earned its place in memory. Every timepiece reminds us of the same lesson, Inspector. That time doesn't stop for death or deceit. It continues, indifferent but constant. And yet, for those who notice, it sometimes tells more than it means to. He laughed quietly. You and your clocks, Miss Marple. I dare say you'd solve half the world's mysteries if only you listened closely enough to the ticking. She folded her hands in her lap, her expression serene. Perhaps, Inspector. But I prefer to listen to people. They're noisier, but much more revealing. The two sat in companionable silence for a while, the warmth of the hearth holding back the evening chill. Beyond the cottage window, the lights of the village began to wink into life, small and scattered like stars reflected on the wet cobbles. The church tower loomed against the fading sky, its clock face faintly luminous, marking another hour in the endless rhythm of village life. As Craddock rose to leave, he paused at the door. You've done it again, Miss Marple. Though I don't know how you managed to see what the rest of us miss. She smiled up at him, that same mild, unassuming smile that had fooled so many over the years. It's quite simple, really, she said. I just notice when people behave as people do, except when they don't. He laughed softly and tipped his hat before stepping out into the dusk. The sound of his footsteps faded down the lane, and Miss Marple sat alone once more, gazing at the fire. The flames flickered and danced, and the steady tick of her own mantel clock filled the room, a small familiar rhythm that seemed to echo the one outside. For a moment she thought of Leonard Quill and Lydia Kane, and even poor Jarvis, each a thread in the same tapestry of folly and fear. And she thought, too, of the Major, sitting now in his lonely drawing-room with the chime of the clock haunting him each hour. With a quiet sigh, she reached to wind her own clock, her fingers steady and sure. "It never stops for long," she murmured, half to herself. "Not even for a corpse." The mechanism began its soft ticking anew. Outside, the wind carried the distant, comforting sound of the church bell across the green. St. Mary Mead slept once more under its watchful rhythm, unaware that beneath its calm surface, human hearts still beat to the same unchanging pattern, fragile, foolish, and endlessly fascinating. And Miss Marple, smiling faintly in the glow of her hearth, resumed her knitting as if nothing at all remarkable had happened, except, of course, that time had told its tale. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Open, 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 open.